good morning everyone. So in this video session, in this video demonstration, so we will learn how to create or to read multiple lines from a text file. So last week, if you can recall, we've had the first time that we've used a file for a program. So we learned how to create, read, and add contents to a text file. So for this week, we're gonna create, or for this demonstration, we're going to create a simple GUI interface where we have a particular text file to read. And as you may notice, this particular text file contains several lines. So what we want to do is we want to read each line and then it will display in our label, for example. Okay, so at the end of this session, we are to create a program similar with this one. So if you have played na MMO ng mga games in relation with our alternative assessment, so you will notice na sila ay sort of dialogue box, no? When they speak, or for example, mga visual novels. So when they speak, usually we see their image and then below their dialogue. So in this demonstration, this program currently does not have any dialogue. But when I press this load dialog button here, it will load this text file that I created. And we should be able to read its content. No? Somehow like we are talking to the character. Okay. So for this demonstration, we're gonna need an image, no? Pwede mo, you may browse the internet. And we'll also need to create a text file. So let's go ahead and create our project for our project folder. So I'm gonna click File. I'm gonna select New Java Project. I'm gonna name this one as Read Lines. I'm not gonna create. I'm just gonna uncheck this Create Module. Finish. For our GUI, I'm gonna be using Window Builder to make it easier for us to create a simple graphical user interface. So I'm gonna select Window Builder, Swing Designer, and then Application Window. I'm gonna call this one as a line reader. Alright, so let's go ahead and create a simple design for our interface. So I'm just gonna be copying katong i-present earlier. So I'm gonna make the layout manager for this one as absolute to make it easier for me to create a J panel. No? So next, I'm gonna create the sort of the chat box where I'm gonna display the text file. So I'm gonna create another panel to display the image of our character. Then I'm gonna be adding the buttons we've seen earlier. So I'm just gonna add it here. Okay, one button would be to load file. And then the others, I'm gonna call this one as previews. And this one, I'm gonna call this as our next button. Alright, so we now have a simple interface. Let me just add border to this one. And I'm going to resize this button here. So this is what we currently have. So next now, I'm going to add an image. So for the image, I'm just going to use a label. I'm gonna set this one first to absolute to make it easier for us, no? But in your case, you may use any, or you may experiment with the different layouts. So in my case, I'm just gonna be using absolute layout to make it easier for me to process this demonstration. So I'm gonna add a label. So the next thing that we need to do now is to set the icon or the image for our label. So to do that, you can simply head over to this icon, no, a button here, and then we will choose. You may select no class path if you save the image within your project folder. It should be displayed here. So for our case, I will be selecting an image from the computer. So I'm going to select absolute path. So and I'm going to select this particular image. So please note no, that selecting the absolute path is only for testing, like for this demonstration. If you want to create or in your project, please select this class path right here. So I have not saved this image in the project folder, so I'm going to select absolute path. I'm going to select OK. And I should be able to see my image here in this particular label. So sometimes you have to adjust the size of our image, or of our label rather, to display the image. So just gonna adjust this image right here. It's okay not to manlapasan yung border, but only the part where the panel is located siya mo display. Alright. Okay, so I'm good with this. So if we try to run our program again, should be able to see an image. Alright, so the next thing that we want to do is we want to create, or we want to add a label to this particular panel where the dialog would be displayed. So I'm again now gonna select absolute for this particular panel, and I'm gonna add here a label. So I'm just gonna change the font size of this particular label to make it readable, and you may also play with the font. So I'm just gonna select any font here. Or this font, for example. And then I'm gonna adjust the size to occupy the entire length of the panel. And I'm gonna set the alignment to left. Alright. So next, for the default text, I'm just gonna change this to dots. So I'm gonna add dots here. So now I'm gonna add the code to load a particular dialog. So this dialog, I'm just gonna create a dialog for. I'm just gonna copy paste this text here. I'm gonna create a new dialog. So for example, I want it here in this read lines folder, project folder. So right click, the new a entitled text file. So I'm gonna put the text file that I've just copied. Control S not to save. Then I want it to be saved here in read lines. I'm gonna call this one as new dialog .txt. After doing that, you will notice that there is a new dialog created within this or saved within this project folder. So let's go ahead and read this dialog. So I'm just gonna double click this load file to generate the listener for this button. Alright, so last week we've learned how to create or to read files from a text file by using these three things. So we have the file, we have the file reader, and we have the buffered reader. And we can actually, instead of writing these three statements here, we can shorten it to one. So we simply write the buffered reader, okay, followed by the identifier, not the name of our buffered reader. And then for its argument, we will be using the file reader. And we also need to specify the arguments for the file reader. In this case, we will put here the path to our file. So in our case, so it's saved on the root folder of the directory. So I can simply write the name of the file itself. So it's gonna give us an error. It's giving us an error. It's gonna say we need to surround it with try and catch. So I'm simply gonna implement this suggestion right here. Okay. So next, we need to for us to save the contents of the file to an array list or to a something that we can manipulate, we need to read the lines from our text file. So to read the lines, we have something that we call as the read line function. So last week we've only used read, but now we're going to be reading the lines. So we will be using the read lines function. So next, let's create our array list to store the contents of our array. So this will be of type string. And then for its identifier, I'm going to call this one as list. Okay, is equal to new array list. And then its type. So this array list will be containing strings. So we may need to import this array list. So for us to store or for us to read each line, we will have to store them on a separate variable. So this temporary variable, I'm going to call this one as string line, str line. I'm going to set its initial value to just an empty string. So an empty string, symbolized or signified by double quote, walay sulod, is different from null. So when you say null, that means there's nothing in there. So but in this case, string line contains an empty lang na string, but not null. So to read the contents of our BR line, so we simply write the name of the string, which will contain the line, is equal to the buffered reader. So in our case, it's BR and then that read line. So notice that it's giving me an error right here. So this error if I hover my mouse over it, it's gonna say that I need to surround or I need to add here a catch clause. So if I select this, okay, add exception to existing catch. So it's gonna add the IO exception. So you can have more than one catch sa imuhang try nga statement. Alright. So next, since we want to read all the lines from our text file, and this particular text file contains multiple mga lines. So we want to read each of these mga lines. So we can do that by enclosing our string line or str line with a while statement. So while the str line is not equal to null, so meaning while napay mabasa na ang atuang string line, while napa siya mabasa ang content or while napay sulod ang atuang dialogue. So here I'm gonna add an if statement. So if str line is equal to null, so meaning it may encounter na to ang iyahang last niya statement or ang iyahang an empty statement, so mag-break ang atuang program. So meaning mag-end ang atuang while statement, mag-end siya sa pag-read sa mga lines. So I'm just gonna add here list that add. Then i-add na to sa tuang list na nga tuang str nga line. So the current line nga yung giread. Let me just put this one inside the while na statement. Okay. So we should now be able to read each of the lines now within the sequence or within the new dialog.txt. So let's not forget to close this BR. So BR close. So let's test now if ma-read mo gina to by outputting ang katong content list. So we can output this, but first we need to convert ng atuang array list to an array, and ito string na to siya, then pwede siyang i-display. So you may do that by following this syntax. So not necessary na to include this, for demonstration lang. So let's try and check if mabasa na ba. So when I click load file, it should display the files increase. Alright. So here we are now able to read now and display the content sa tuang lists or sa tuang text file. So next is we want to display each of these na mga lines individually ngadto sa tuang i-specify nga text box. So when I press previous or next, it should display the lines. No? So here I'm gonna create something we call as iterator. So an iterator or list iterator, to be specific, will iterate through my list. So I'm gonna call this one as IT dialog, for example. And I'm gonna set this to list. Okay, that list iterator. Okay, we'll be using list iterator now, so we can iterate through the list. So this list iterator here, we may need to do some import. So let me just import this one here. So this list iterator contains functions such as has next or has previous to check if napabay sulod ang atuang iterator. So I'm just gonna specify that this should be reading string. Okay, so I think we're good. So I'm gonna rename this button with identifier next, and this previous button with prev now, to make it easier for me and for us to manipulate this. And also one more thing, we need to declare these two buttons as global na mga variables for us to access them. Okay, we will be transferring these buttons na, so akong i-cut ang iyang auto-generate na action listener, and I will paste it here. Notice that it's giving me an error since it's outside of the scope of this particular method. So for us to use this prev button, okay, we need to declare it as a global variable. So I'm just gonna go over the top. I'm gonna declare it as a J button. And then we have next and prev the buttons. So it should, alright, so it's now, just remove this J button declaration here to avoid redeclaration. And now we are able to use the prev button here inside this particular nga method. Okay, so let's iterate through our list. So I am gonna create an if nga statement. So if our iterator can detect a next nga value, so meaning if it still has a next nga value, so meaning it's not empty. So I want to this is create dialog. It should display it here in this particular label. So I'm just gonna rename this label right here with dialog label. So I'm gonna set the text of our dialog label. That set text. Then I will select this current na iyang value or iyang next nga value rather. So I'm simply gonna write here IT dialog dot next. And then type niya is string. So we need to convert it to string, no? Since to set the text has to be a string. IT dialog. Alright. So again, if IT dialog has a next nga value, it will get that next nga value and it will set it to the value of this dialog label. So I'm gonna do the same, no? I'm just gonna, sorry, it should be next, and this one should be previous. So for the previous nga button, you simply need to replace it with has previous, no? To detect the previous nga value, and the next with previous nga method. So when we run our program, no, notice nga if I click previous and next I have not yet clicked the load file, no? So after clicking the load file, it should display the text, previous next. And that should be the output of our program.